New Jersey always looked calm from the outside. Tree-lined streets, modest houses pressed close together, lawns trimmed just enough to signal effort, but never excess. It was a place built on routines, on the idea that stability was a form of success. For her, that calm had once felt like safety. For him, it had always felt like a limitation. She grew up understanding the sound of scarcity, not dramatic hunger, not the kind that turns into headlines, but the quieter version that settled into daily decisions. Bills paid late, clothes bought with careful timing, dreams adjusted before they ever reached full size. Her childhood was shaped by a mother who worked until her hands cracked, and a father who left early, not in anger, but in exhaustion. She learned early that love often survived without comfort, and that dignity could exist even when money did not. By the time she met him, she carried that lesson quietly. She did not announce it. She did not apologize for it. It simply lived inside her posture, in the way she never wasted food, in how she folded clothes neatly, no matter how old they were. She believed in building slowly, in choosing patience over spectacle. He came from the other side of the same town, not wealthy, but surrounded by the illusion of upward movement. His family spoke often about what was coming next, about the life that was supposed to arrive if one just worked hard enough and aligned with the right people. Their living room displayed symbols of ambition: certificates, framed photos, small signs that suggested progress. He grew up absorbing the idea that love was important, but success was proof. When they met, it felt uncomplicated. She admired his certainty. He admired her steadiness. Their relationship unfolded in small domestic gestures, shared meals, long walks after work, evenings that felt full despite their simplicity. She believed they were moving towards something shared. He believed at first that love might be enough to bridge the distance between who he was and who he intended to become. The engagement was quiet, no crowd, no spectacle, a ring chosen carefully, not extravagantly. She accepted it with trembling hands and a certainty that surprised even herself. She imagined a future that looked like continuity rather than transformation. A modest wedding, a life built piece by piece. She spoke openly about it, about not needing more than what they already had, about valuing meaning over display. For her, the wedding was not a performance. It was a transition, a promise lived privately. For him, something shifted the moment plans began to take shape. The conversations that followed were subtle at first. Questions about venues, about expectations, about what people would think. He listened, nodded, smiled, but somewhere beneath that surface, disappointment began to form. It was not her fault, he told himself. It was reality. Appearances mattered. The world they lived in judged before it understood. A small wedding felt like an announcement of failure, a lack of ambition. He imagined faces at the reception, imagined comparisons, imagined whispers. He told himself he was thinking practically, responsibly. She noticed the distance before she understood its cause. The way his presence thinned, the way excitement drained from his movements, the way his eyes seemed to measure things now, including her. She did not ask directly. She waited, believing time would resolve what love could not immediately explain. She assumed doubt was temporary. The decision came without warning. Days before the wedding, the plans dissolved. Not slowly, not gently. One moment, she was arranging details in her mind. The next, everything was gone. The reason was delivered without warmth, without apology, stripped down to its most brutal form. She did not have money. And that apparently was enough. The cancellation was efficient, swift. The aftermath was not. News traveled quickly in a town like theirs. Invitations unfulfilled, assumptions made, sympathy offered awkwardly, curiosity sharpened by silence. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She simply withdrew. What followed was not immediate transformation. There was no dramatic exit, no sudden reinvention. There was only absence, a quiet disappearance from shared spaces. She left the routines they once shared and replaced them with work, with solitude, with the relentless effort of survival. He moved on, convinced of his reasoning. He framed the decision as maturity, as foresight, as the painful but necessary choice of someone unwilling to settle. He told himself that love without progress was stagnation. Years passed. She worked jobs that offered no glamour. She learned systems. She learned endurance. She learned how to fail without collapsing. Each setback hardened her resolve. Each small victory expanded her sense of possibility. There was no audience for her growth, no validation, only the slow accumulation of competence, of insight, of resilience. What changed everything was not luck alone. It was a decision made when she had nothing left to protect, an opportunity that required risk, a willingness to step into uncertainty without guarantees. She took it, and the world began quietly to respond. The opportunity did not announce itself with grandeur. It arrived disguised as inconvenience, as instability, as something most people would decline without reflection. It demanded longer hours, uncertain pay, and the humility of starting from the bottom in an environment that rewarded speed over sympathy. For someone already exhausted by years of survival, it could have been the final discouragement. She accepted it anyway. There was something liberating in having nothing left to lose. The humiliation that once felt unbearable had already passed through her life and left its mark. What remained was a sharpened clarity. She no longer needed approval. She needed traction. Her days became regimented. Early mornings, late nights, learning curves that punished mistakes without mercy. She absorbed knowledge the way she once rationed food carefully, intentionally, aware that waste could be fatal. She watched others closely, not with envy, but with attention. She studied how confidence was constructed, how decisions were framed, how authority often came not from brilliance but from certainty. Failure followed her closely in those years. Projects collapsed, promises evaporated. There were moments when exhaustion pressed so hard against her chest that breathing felt optional. She cried rarely, not because she felt less, but because time felt too expensive to spend on despair. When money came, it arrived unevenly. When it disappeared, it did so abruptly. She learned to detach her identity from numbers, even as she pursued them relentlessly. Wealth, she understood now, was not just accumulation, it was insulation, protection, control over time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to align. A partnership formed after a risk others dismissed. A calculated move paid off when conditions shifted unexpectedly. She recognized patterns before they became obvious, trusted her instincts when data lagged behind reality. Her background, once perceived as a weakness, became her advantage. She understood scarcity at a cellular level. She knew how quickly comfort could vanish. Years passed without ceremony. She changed cities briefly, then returned. She refined her presence, not extravagantly, but deliberately. Her confidence was not loud. It was precise. She no longer entered rooms seeking permission. By the time financial security settled into permanence, it did so without celebration. There was no moment of disbelief, no dramatic pause. Only the quiet realization that survival was no longer her primary occupation. Meanwhile, his life progressed along expected lines. He married someone who fit easily into the image he envisioned, someone who matched the aesthetic of success, who understood the performance required. The wedding was large, carefully curated, admired. For a time, it seemed he had chosen correctly, but ambition has a way of revealing its cost slowly. The pressure to maintain appearances never eased. Progress became mandatory, not aspirational. Each achievement reset expectations higher, leaving satisfaction permanently deferred. He succeeded, but never settled. He built a life that looked impressive from a distance and felt narrow from within. Occasionally, a thought surfaced uninvited, a memory of her quiet steadiness, the way she listened without judgment. He dismissed it as nostalgia, as sentimentality incompatible with forward momentum. He did not know she had returned. He did not know her name now circulated in spaces he had never accessed. He did not recognize the company she built, the influence she wielded discreetly. He did not connect the story of a rising figure in business articles with the woman he once deemed insufficient. The encounter was accidental, a charity event, an environment saturated with confidence and curated generosity. He attended as a professional obligation, expecting nothing more than routine networking. When he saw her, recognition lagged behind shock. She did not look transformed in the obvious ways. She looked composed, grounded, untouchable. She did not acknowledge him immediately. There was no dramatic pause, no visible reckoning, just a brief alignment of awareness that passed through her eyes without disruption. He felt, for the first time in years, the instability of being unseen. When realization finally settled, it came with weight. She was not there to be validated. She was not there to prove anything. Her presence was natural, earned, unquestioned. Others gravitated toward her with respect that required no explanation. He understood then, with an ache that surprised him, that her success was not a reaction to his rejection. It was a continuation of who she had always been, finally unrestrained, and he had walked away from it. He spent the rest of that evening unsettled in ways he could not articulate. The room felt louder, the conversations thinner, the laughter around him strangely rehearsed. He watched her from a distance without daring to approach, observing how she moved through the space with an ease that did not seek approval. People listened when she spoke, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence carried weight. He searched her face for traces of the woman he once knew. The softness was still there, but it had been reorganized. Strength had not replaced tenderness. It had protected it. She smiled when appropriate, nodded when necessary, disengaged without apology. Every gesture communicated choice. He realized then that his memory of her had been frozen in the moment he left. He had preserved her as incomplete, unfinished, dependent. Seeing her now forced him to confront how little imagination he had allowed her. That night, sleep evaded him. His mind replayed fragments he had long dismissed. Her patience, her consistency, the way she never spoke about what she lacked, only about what could be built. He wondered how he had once mistaken quiet resilience for insufficiency. The days that followed unsettled him further. Her name appeared more frequently, not as gossip, but as reference. In articles, in conversations among people he respected. Each mention tightened something inside his chest. He considered reaching out. The impulse came not from strategy, but from discomfort. A desire to be seen differently by her, to revise the past, to soften the verdict of his own memory. But restraint stopped him. He sensed instinctively that contact would not unfold on his terms. She, on the other hand, felt nothing urgent. Seeing him had not reopened wounds. It had confirmed closure. The past no longer demanded explanation. It existed, acknowledged, but powerless. Her life now moved at a different rhythm. Decisions carried consequences far beyond personal comfort. Employees depended on her judgment. Communities benefited from her investments. She carried responsibility with gravity, never forgetting how fragile stability could be. At night, alone, she sometimes revisited those early years, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. She wondered how differently things might have unfolded had he believed in her, but the thought never lingered. The version of herself that might have stayed no longer existed. When they crossed paths again, it was deliberate, a business meeting arranged by intermediaries who had no knowledge of their history. The irony did not escape her. She entered the room prepared, professional, emotionally neutral. He arrived tense, rehearsed, uncertain. The power dynamic was unmistakable. He spoke carefully, measuring each word, acutely aware of how much he wanted her respect. She listened attentively, evaluating content rather than intention. Their interaction was efficient, polite, uneventful to anyone else observing. But beneath that surface, he felt exposed. He realized that the man she faced now was the sum of his choices, just as she embodied the accumulation of hers. The difference lay in ownership. She stood comfortably within her trajectory. He felt suddenly constrained by his. The meeting concluded without acknowledgement of their shared past. She offered nothing beyond professionalism. He received nothing beyond courtesy. That absence was devastating. He had expected confrontation, or forgiveness, or recognition. What he encountered instead was indifference shaped by fulfillment. She did not need resolution. She had outgrown the question. In the weeks that followed, his marriage strained under pressures it had long avoided. Naming, conversations grew hollow, ambitions misaligned. The life he had built began to feel like a structure assembled for display rather than habitation. He did not blame her. He blamed himself. He understood, finally, that his choice had not been about money. It had been about fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of standing still. Fear of trusting something invisible over something measurable. She continued forward, unaffected, and that was the cruelest revelation of all. Time did not slow for his realization. It moved forward with the same indifference it always had, but something in him lagged behind, tethered to an understanding that arrived too late. Regret did not erupt dramatically. It seeped in quietly, filling spaces he had never examined before. he began to notice the emptiness in moments that once felt successful. The applause at work meetings sounded thinner. The metrics he chased felt abstract. His home, polished and curated, lacked warmth. Conversations with his wife remained functional but distant, structured around logistics rather than intimacy. They had built a life efficiently, but not deeply. He saw now how often he had mistaken movement for progress. The memory of her presence haunted him, not because she was gone, but because she was complete. She had become something he could no longer imagine influencing. Her independence stripped him of relevance, and that absence unsettled him more than rejection ever could. He considered briefly the idea of apology, not for reconciliation, but for release. Yet even that felt self-serving. He understood that apologies offered late often exist more for the comfort of the speaker than for the healing of the recipient. She owed him nothing. She continued expanding her work deliberately. Her investments began to lean toward initiatives that mirrored her own past education, training, access to capital for those dismissed early. She did not advertise these choices. She understood visibility was optional when impact was real. Her wealth insulated her, but it did not isolate her. She remained attentive to detail, to people, to the quiet signals of struggle others overlooked. Power had not hardened her. It had clarified her. Occasionally, she sensed his awareness hovering at the edges of shared spaces. His hesitation, his restraint. She did not interpret it as longing. She recognized it as reckoning. There was no satisfaction in it, only distance. Their final encounter came without planning, without intermediaries. A quiet afternoon. A shared space neither expected the other to occupy. Recognition passed between them without ceremony. This time, she acknowledged him first, not with warmth, not with coldness, with neutrality. The exchange was brief, efficient. He thanked her for her time once, for something she could not quite identify. She nodded, accepting the gesture without attaching meaning to it. As they parted, she felt no shift. No unresolved emotion surfaced. The past remained exactly where it belonged. For him, the moment lingered. He understood then that redemption does not always arrive as forgiveness. Sometimes it arrives as clarity and an unalterable understanding of who one was when it mattered most. He returned to his life carrying that weight quietly. He adjusted expectations. He softened ambitions. He learned to value substance over perception. She moved forward unburdened. Her success was no longer a response to absence. It was a presence fully realized, and somewhere within that realization, the irony settled permanently, not as triumph, not as vengeance, but as truth. He had left her because she was poor, and in doing so, he had walked away from the richest future he would ever know. The months that followed did not announce themselves as a turning point. There were no visible collapses, no dramatic resignations, no public unraveling. From the outside, his life retained its structure. Inside, however, something essential had shifted, and the shift refused to be ignored. He began noticing the cost of every decision he had once defended so confidently. The way his career demanded constant validation. The way relationships had been selected for alignment rather than connection. He recognized how often he had edited himself to fit expectations that were never truly his. The realization did not inspire courage. It inspired grief. Grief for a version of himself he had abandoned long before he ever abandoned her. Grief for the life he might have lived had he trusted something quieter, less measurable, less admired. At work, his performance remained strong, but his motivation dulled. Goals felt arbitrary. Advancement no longer promised fulfillment, only maintenance. The ladder he had climbed so relentlessly now looked endless, offering elevation without arrival. At home, silence expanded. His marriage did not fracture dramatically. It thinned. The shared future they had planned became a checklist rather than a vision. They coexisted efficiently, bonded by habit and shared investment rather than intimacy. The contrast between what looked successful and what felt meaningful grew impossible to ignore. He did not speak her name, not aloud. He understood that invoking it would force explanations he was not ready to offer. She, meanwhile, experienced a different quiet. Success brought attention, but also solitude of a particular kind. People approached her with agendas, with admiration shaped by utility. She navigated these interactions with discernment, aware that access now carried value, yet her inner world remained intact. She did not feel hardened by wealth. She felt expanded. Possibility no longer required permission. Time became her most valuable resource, and she guarded it carefully. Occasionally, she revisited memories of her former self with compassion. The woman who believed love could compensate for instability. The woman who endured humiliation without defense. She did not judge that version harshly. She honored her endurance. She understood now that dignity did not come from being chosen. It came from choosing oneself when no one else would. Her work began to take on a different texture. Less urgency, more intention. She delegated without guilt. She stepped back when necessary. She allowed space for a life that did not revolve entirely around proving anything. In rare moments of stillness, she wondered whether he had learned. Not out of longing, but curiosity. She hoped he had. Not for her sake, but for his own. The world continued moving. Years layered themselves quietly on top of old wounds until those wounds became part of the foundation rather than the surface. Her name grew synonymous with consistency, not spectacle. His with reliability, not inspiration. They never spoke again, and yet, their story remained unfinished in a way stories often are, not because something was missing, but because something had already been decided. The difference lay in who carried that knowledge as liberation, and who carried it as consequence. Time continued its steady advance. Indifferent to reflection, unmoved by regret, it pressed forward, carrying both of them deeper into the lives they had constructed, one with intention reclaimed, the other with intention postponed. For him, the awareness never fully receded. It matured instead. What once felt like acute discomfort evolved into a constant undertone, a low-frequency hum beneath daily routines. He learned to function with it, the way one learns to live with a scar that no longer bleeds but still tightens when the weather changes. He began making quieter choices, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would rewrite his story in headlines or impress those who once mattered. He declined certain opportunities. He questioned timelines. He allowed himself to remain where he was, even when ambition whispered that stagnation equaled failure. This restraint confused people around him. They interpreted it as contentment, or fatigue, or pragmatism. None of those were entirely false, but beneath them lived a different truth. He no longer trusted his instincts the way he once had. He had seen too clearly where they had led him before. At home, the distance between him and his wife grew polite, cordial, almost professional. They managed responsibilities well. They shared space efficiently. But the emotional terrain remained largely unexplored, avoided by mutual unspoken agreement. There was no villain in their story. Only two people who had chosen alignment over depth and discovered, too late, that alignment alone could not sustain intimacy. For her, life unfolded with a different cadence. She moved into a home that reflected her values rather than her status. Comfortable, understated, filled with light. She curated her surroundings with care, selecting objects that carried meaning rather than prestige. Each decision reinforced her sense of authorship over her own life. She traveled selectively, not to escape, but to observe. She listened more than she spoke. She invested in people who reminded her of herself before certainty arrived, those who worked without recognition, who carried ambition quietly, who understood effort as survival. She never spoke publicly about her past, not because she felt shame, but because she refused to let it become spectacle. Her story was not a cautionary tale or a redemption arc. It was a sequence of choices, nothing more, nothing less. Yet the emotional residue of that early humiliation never fully disappeared. It transformed instead. It sharpened her sensitivity to power imbalances. It informed how she treated others when she held authority. She understood how easily dignity could be stripped away by indifference. That understanding guided her more than any strategy ever had. Years later, when news reached him indirectly, an award, a recognition, a philanthropic initiative bearing her influence, he did not feel the sharpness he once had. Instead, a quiet acceptance settled over him. He saw then that her success was not ironic. It was inevitable. She had always possessed the capacity to build something enduring. What she had lacked was not ability, but opportunity and someone willing to see her potential without demanding proof. That realization carried no bitterness now, only clarity. He never attempted to reinsert himself into her narrative. He understood that doing so would distort something sacred. Her life no longer contained space for unresolved history, and he respected that boundary fully. In moments of solitude, he allowed himself one honest admission. Leaving her had been the most consequential decision of his life, not because it led to her success, and not because it led to his dissatisfaction, but because it revealed, with unforgiving precision, who he had been when tested. That knowledge became his inheritance. She, on the other hand, carried something lighter. Her fulfillment did not come from contrast or comparison. It came from coherence. Her inner life aligned with her outer one. The woman she had become made sense to the girl she once was. That harmony was her quiet victory. There came a season when his life slowed in ways he had not anticipated. Not from failure, not from illness, but from a gradual narrowing of urgency. The future no longer stretched before him with promise. It repeated itself instead, offering variations of the same outcomes, the same compromises, the same carefully managed expectations. He became more observant during that time. He noticed how often people spoke about achievement without ever mentioning meaning. How frequently success was framed as distance from origins, from vulnerability, from anything that might expose uncertainty. He recognized his own voice in those patterns, echoes of beliefs he had once defended without question. The recognition was sobering. He began walking more alone, through neighborhoods that reminded him of earlier years, streets where ambition had once felt innocent, where hope had not yet been measured against perception. He watched young couples move through those spaces with unpolished dreams, and he wondered how many of them would mistake potential for risk and risk for failure. There was no resentment in the thought, only gravity. At home, change arrived quietly. His marriage did not end abruptly. It dissolved through mutual exhaustion. Conversations that once circled avoidance finally acknowledged emptiness. Separation unfolded without drama, without accusation. Two people recognizing that what they had built no longer required defense. The ending felt appropriate, clean, honest. He moved into a smaller space, simplified routines, reduced noise. For the first time in decades, he lived without performance. The absence of expectation unsettled him at first, then steadied him. He did not rebuild. He adjusted. She heard of these shifts distantly, if at all. Information reached her filtered, incomplete, and irrelevant. His life no longer intersected with her own trajectory in any meaningful way. Her days filled with purpose that did not announce itself loudly. She mentored quietly. She funded projects without attaching her name. She created structures designed to outlast her presence. In moments of solitude, she sometimes returned to the memory of the wedding that never happened. Not as loss, but as divergence. A path that closed so another could open. She understood now that rejection had not diminished her. It had redirected her. Pain had sharpened her discernment. Silence had taught her scale. There was no fantasy of reunion, no imagined reconciliation. The story between them had ended exactly where it needed to. Late one evening, after a long day that had required difficult decisions, she stood alone by a window overlooking the city she now called home. Lights stretched outward endlessly, each one a marker of a life unfolding with its own private weight. She did not feel triumphant. She felt complete, somewhere else. In a quieter space, he sat with a similar view, smaller, dimmer, but honest. He thought of her once more, not with longing, not with regret, but with respect. He acknowledged finally that loving her would have required a courage he had not yet possessed. The realization no longer hurt. It simply was, and in that acceptance, both of them continued forward separately, irreversibly carrying the consequences of a single choice made long ago, when love had stood beside fear, and only one of them had been trusted. The years that followed did not carry surprises. They carried weight. For him, life became an exercise in presence rather than pursuit. He learned how to sit with himself without distraction, how to endure evenings without noise, how to accept mornings without ambition driving every movement. The silence that once terrified him now felt instructive. It revealed patterns he had long ignored, values he had postponed, instincts he had overridden in favor of appearance. He did not become a different man. He became a clearer one. There were moments when memory resurfaced without invitation, not as scenes, but as sensations. The feeling of standing on the edge of a decision, the memory of how certainty had felt safer than trust. He did not relive the breakup itself. He relived the version of himself who believed love needed to justify itself economically. That version felt distant now, almost unfamiliar. He volunteered occasionally, not out of redemption, but out of grounding. He listened more than he spoke. He learned how little most people needed to feel seen, and how rarely they were. In quiet ways, he practiced a courage he had once lacked, the courage to remain when no one was watching. She continued shaping a life that balanced scale with restraint. Her influence expanded, but her visibility did not. She chose anonymity where possible, impact where necessary. The younger versions of herself she encountered through her work recognized something in her they could not name, a steadiness that did not require permission, an authority born not of dominance but of endurance. She offered guidance sparingly. She knew that growth could not be handed over. It had to be claimed. In rare, unguarded moments, she allowed herself to feel pride, not in wealth, not in recognition, but in survival transformed into authorship. She had not escaped her past. She had integrated it. That integration made her gentle. On an unremarkable day, years removed from the rupture that had once defined her, she passed a small wedding taking place in a public park. Folding chairs, simple arrangements, laughter unpolished and sincere. The scene paused her briefly. She did not feel envy. She felt understanding. She knew now that love was not diminished by modesty, nor strengthened by display. It required alignment, courage, and timing. And timing, she had learned, was not something one could force. She walked on without looking back. If their lives ever brushed against each other again, it was only an abstraction in the shared geography of memory, in the faint echo of a choice that had shaped them both. There were no reunions left to imagine, no conversations waiting to be had. What remained was consequence, not punishment, not reward, just consequence. He lived knowing he had chosen safety over faith, and that the cost of that choice had been paid slowly, privately, and in full. She lived knowing she had been underestimated, and that her response had not been defiance, but construction. In the end, neither of them carried anger, only clarity, and clarity, unlike regret, did not demand resolution. It simply stayed. Age arrived for both of them without ceremony. For him, it came in the form of slowing mornings, of joints that reminded him of time's persistence, of mirrors that reflected a face softened by restraint rather than sharpened by ambition. He accepted these changes with a humility he would not have recognized in his younger self. There was no race left to win, no audience to convince. He spent more time reading, less time explaining himself. He allowed friendships to fade naturally instead of forcing relevance. What remained was smaller, but truer. Sometimes, when walking alone in the early hours, he thought about how easily life could fracture at its quietest points. How one decision, delivered calmly, rationally, could redirect entire decades. He did not dramatize the thought. He no longer needed to. The woman he had once loved existed now as a fixed truth rather than a variable. She was no longer a question. She was an answer he had failed to recognize when it mattered. That knowledge did not poison him. It educated him. For her, age manifested differently. It brought perspective without fragility. Her confidence no longer sharpened with achievement. It softened with understanding. She stopped expanding for the sake of growth and began refining for the sake of alignment. She chose fewer projects, deeper ones. Her name appeared less frequently, but when it did, it carried weight. She had become someone whose absence was noticed more than her presence was announced. She never married, not because she rejected love, but because she refused compromise disguised as compatibility. She had learned too well what it meant to be assessed rather than known. If love arrived, it would have to meet her whole, not the version shaped by survival, but the one shaped by choice. It never did, and she did not mourn that. Her life was full in ways that resisted summary. Friendships rooted in history. Work that left visible marks. Days structured by intention rather than urgency. On certain evenings, she allowed herself to sit with the stillness she had once feared. She remembered the woman she had been, standing quietly in the aftermath of humiliation, absorbing judgment without defense, carrying grief without witnesses. She felt tenderness for her. That woman had not known what awaited her. She had only known that survival required movement, even without direction. And that had been enough. The world changed around them. New technologies, new crises, new languages of success. They observed these shifts from different vantage points, equally removed from the center they had once chased. If fate had a sense of irony, it expressed it gently. The man who once believed wealth defined stability, learned to live with little noise and fewer possessions. The woman once defined by lack learned that abundance did not require excess. Neither of them spoke the lesson aloud. They did not need to. Toward the later years of his life, he developed a habit of sitting near the window at dusk, not to think, not to remember deliberately, but to let the day recede without resistance. The light would thin gradually, dissolving the edges of buildings, softening everything it touched. He found comfort in that transition. It asked nothing of him. He no longer framed his past as a series of mistakes. He saw it as a map of thresholds, moments when he had chosen certainty over vulnerability, structure over intuition. Each choice had felt justified at the time. Each had carried consequences that revealed themselves only later. He understood now that fear rarely announces itself honestly. It often disguises itself as logic. There were no final confessions waiting to be made, no letters written and left unsent. He had learned that closure was not something one delivered to another person. It was something one earned internally, through acceptance rather than repair. When illness came, it did so quietly, manageable at first, then persistent. He adjusted his routines without complaint, reduced his world further, let others step in where independence once mattered too much. In those final months, memories surfaced less frequently. What remained was sensation, texture, the feeling of walking beside someone who believed in building slowly, the memory of warmth without spectacle. He did not attach her name to those impressions. He did not need to. They were enough. She learned of his passing indirectly, through a chain of information that reached her without urgency. The news arrived on an ordinary day, folded into routine, stripped of drama. She paused, not because grief demanded it, but because respect did. She sat for a long while afterward, not thinking about what had been lost, but about what had been revealed, about how two lives could intersect briefly and still shape each other irrevocably, about how endings did not require reconciliation to be complete. There was no sadness sharp enough to disrupt her breathing, only a stillness dense and reflective. She did not attend any service. She did not reach out to anyone connected to him. Her mourning, if it could be called that, remained internal, dignified, unobserved. That evening, she walked through her home slowly, touching familiar objects, grounded in the life she had authored deliberately. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Inside, everything felt aligned. She understood then that her story had never been about proving him wrong. It had been about proving herself whole. The wedding that never happened had not been a failure. It had been a narrowing, one path closing so another could widen. The humiliation she had endured had not defined her. It had refined her, and the wealth she had built had not elevated her. It had protected the freedom she had earned long before money ever arrived. She turned off the lights one by one, letting darkness settle naturally. Somewhere in that quiet, the past finally loosened its grip, not because it was forgiven, not because it was forgotten, but because it had fulfilled its purpose. To lives, one choice. And no villains, no heroes, only consequence, carried with honesty, and a future, long since claimed, that no longer needed comparison to feel complete.